lets me record to the cloud. So they actually sent us it's recording. They actually sent us a email saying that we can't even set it to automatically record, because I guess everyone was just automatically recording and it's taking up all the space. So you have to remind me. There's no way for me to set it so it automatically does it. All right, you guys on Zoom, you got any questions? Anyone have questions?
No, I'm okay.
We're all good for now?
Just in person. Are we like every Monday and Wednesday? Like, how does this work? Because that's why I didn't do it today, because I'm a little confused.
The in-person is just Wednesdays.
Okay.
We're staying virtual.
Okay.
However, for next week, since we changed the exam, it's going to be virtual.
Okay.
So for next week, we're just gonna do all virtual, and then the following week we'll come in that Wednesday, if we're doing in-person classes.
Correct. But how come only 2 people are here today? See, this is my issue, right, guys? I'm going to come to campus. There's supposed to be 7 people, I think, here, and there's 2, right? So it may just go back to all virtual, because it's not really fair to me, and it's actually going to be worse for the 2 people sitting in the class, because I have to try to, man the other 18 of you that are on Zoom, right, guys? So if you're planning on coming to class, please come. It makes things a lot better for everyone, right? You guys agree? All right, so anyway, so yes, it will be Wednesday in person. That's our plan. Wednesdays in person, Mondays we keep virtual. Next week, since we had to move the exam, Wednesday will be a virtual day. I may email you guys and say, hey, anyone who wants to come in person on Monday, I'll be here Monday. Do you know what I mean? Just so that we don't lose that in-person day. I'll let you guys know. Unfortunately, that kind of screws with my schedule and stuff like that, because my husband's not going to stay home from work another day. So I'll let you guys know, okay? If you guys feel like, or even like later on in the day, if somebody wants to kind of like do a review, like an in-person review, we can set that up. Do you know what I mean? So then you don't feel like you don't lose that, okay? All right, guys, you hear that? So I'll let you know about Monday. But exam will be Wednesday. It will be obviously remote, delivered through Moodle, okay? And there will be multiple choice and essays on there. The essays probably will be like case study style ones. I think I'm gonna try to kind of keep it like that for now. For chapter 4, and I'll talk about this when we review chapter 4, I may, there's a couple of things that I thought about that would be good essay questions. So I'll give you some hints about that. So maybe not every single one of them will be a case study, but probably most of them will be kind of set up that way, just because we did the case studies, right? And we're a little bit familiar with it. Or it'll kind of be that style. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same exact case study, but likely I'll probably use some of the case studies that are in our textbook. Okay, guys? Anyone have questions about that? No? Yes, no, anyone? All right. You guys, anything? No? Okay. All right, so that review sheet for, right, chapters 1 through 4. So we should all be pretty much caught up with listening to all the recordings for chapters 1 through 4, yes? Did we all? Yeah? And maybe you have to listen to them again, that's fine. We're gonna, and we'll review chapter 4 predominantly today after we go over that quiz, okay? So anything you guys want me to go over, let me know. But my plan is to kind of focus on chapter 4. We'll go over the case study. I'll even go over the other case study as well. Oh, another question. So you guys saw that I uploaded this video. I mean, it was kind of not really a very, I guess, I don't know, not a complete review of chapter 3, right? But I wanted to make sure I put up the review questions, went through them with you guys, and put up the case study, right? Because there's like a ton of case studies in chapter 3, okay? So make sure if you haven't looked at that, you do. And then, like I said, we can go over more of those, and we can spend some time, maybe even on Monday, to do some of those case studies. That might be a good plan. Anyone have questions about that, or did anyone listen to that, or we're good with that? So the other thing I did too, I put up all the chapter summaries and the review questions in PDF form, just so that if you want to kind of look at them that way. So where did I put that? That's here, okay? So if you click on that, that has chapters. I put these together in one PDF, but chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, chapter summary, and the review questions, okay? The answers to the review questions in chapter 3, I went over in that video. I think we already did the ones for chapter 2. And then we'll do them for chapter 4 today. Okay, so we're going to go over the answers. That doesn't have the answers. Okay, the answers, remember, are in the back of the book. And we go over them in class. So those are there for you just for extra kind of little practice if you want to go over them again. All right? Okay, I think that's most of what I sort of updated. There's some more stuff, but anyway, we shall move on. We went over the chapter 2 case study, right? Yeah, okay. Okay, so let's go over the chapter 2-3 quiz first, guys. Let me just make sure. Well, if you didn't take it, then too bad. But I'm pretty sure everyone took it. Let me preview it. Okay. All right, guys, so question 1 there. Are proteins that bind, what are proteins that bind to DNA? You guys should know this from cell bio, not from patho. What is it?
Yo, it's D.
Thank you. D. All right. In DNA, same thing. We should just know this because we're biology majors, right? Adenine pairs with what?
Thymine. B.
B, thymine. A pairs with T. Same thing. You should just know this. Epigenetic changes are changes in the DNA sequence that can be passed on to future generations. True or false, guys?
False.
False. Why? Somebody tell me why.
Everything is true except changes in the DNA sequence.
Correct. They're not changes in the DNA sequence. What kind of changes are they? Somebody else.
Change in gene expression.
Okay. Well, yeah. Ultimately, they'll lead to a change in gene expression, but what types of changes are they? If it's not changing an A to a T or something like that, what changes are we talking about?
In the amino acids?
Who was that? Abby?
Yeah.
Amino acids, you said? Well, again, ultimately, it might lead to a change in amino acid. Marianne, what do you think? What kind of changes? Not the gene sequence, if you're talking about epigenetics, right? Remember, like, think of some kind of, like, we talked about this, specifically in cell bio. Remember we talked about, like, acetylation of the histones, or adding methyl groups, even adding methyl groups to the DNA or methyl groups to the histones. So they're things that are going to alter how that DNA is packaged, right? And maybe make the DNA more available for transcription and things like that. So that's why we say it affects.
Wouldn't that just affect gene expression?
Correct, it affects gene expression, but I'm asking you, how does it affect gene expression? What are the actual changes, right? The changes, the epigenetic changes are adding a methyl group, right? Or adding an acetyl group to a histone, okay? Things like that. So I'm just trying to get us to kind of think about what kind of changes we're talking about. To be honest, in here, right, I'm not going to really get technical about specific changes, but I just wanted to kind of give you guys an example so you understand what that kind of means. Does that make sense, guys?
Dr. C, do you mean the nonsense, the silent mutations, or that's a different thing?
That's different. So when we're talking about mutations, what do we mean now? What's changing?
Amino acids.
The DNA sequence.
But the DNA sequence, right? So we're talking about a mutation, and that means there's a change in the DNA sequence that then ultimately may lead to a change in the amino acid, right? With epigenetic changes, the DNA sequence doesn't change. It's just some other factor or molecule that interacts with the DNA that is changed that then alters the expression. It's kind of a hard concept to conceptualize. That's why I'm trying to give you guys like an example. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and so why do we call it genetic? Because it can be passed on, right? It can be passed down through generations, even though it's not a change in the DNA sequence. So this is that's definitely a newer field, right? I don't know when we sort of first identified an epigenetic change, but it's not something that's that old. So we're still learning about what they mean, right? And we read a paper in Cell Bio about epigenetics and Parkinson's disease. Anyone remember that? See, even Marianne remembers that, and that was not last year. It was a year, right? Remember, it talked about those HATs, those enzymes that add the acetyl groups, and those HDACs. Does that ring a bell, anyone? Probably can't even understand what I'm saying with your mask on.
Yeah, it does.
Just say yes so we can move on. All right, cool. All right, guys. Next one. We're going to run out of time on the quizzes and boot me out. Methylmercury is considered a blank hazard. What type of hazard is methylmercury?
Chemical.
Chemical. And one of the case studies focuses on methylmercury, right? So where do you find methylmercury? How would you be exposed to it?
Seafood.
Industries.
That's through food? Somebody else, what kind of food?
Fish.
Fish. And why? Is it because fish produce methylmercury?
They were exposed to it,
Yeah.
like
You know how?
leak, and they ingested, and then we eat the fish.
Yeah, not necessarily specifically from oil spills, but one of the examples, I guess, even volcanic eruptions and like coal burning, when that enters the atmosphere, produces that, and then it settles into the oceans. And then, so in certain areas where you have a lot of that going on, that's where you're gonna have water contaminated with that methylmercury, right? And so if you're eating a lot of fish from that specific area, you can actually be exposed. I mean, I guess the idea is like, you know how, I don't know if you guys ever heard that when you're pregnant, you're not supposed to eat a lot of fish because of kind of things like this, but I would think in actuality, most fish are safe, right? It would only be in areas where you had this, I don't know, coal burning or some sort of pollutant going on that then deposited in those areas in the water. All right, so chemical, right? All right. A blank health event is described as an environmental health problem that will not only affect the individual, but also others in the home, workplace, or community environments. What's the term for this? Sentinel. Now, I don't like this. I still, to be honest, when I was going through doing this lecture again, I still like was trying to like find a way to like really understand why this is different than, so do you guys agree that if we're talking about diseases caused by an environmental factor, wouldn't it always affect more than the individual, right? So that's why I don't know, it's hard for me to kind of understand why there's a different term for this, I guess. So I didn't make up the term, but I guess the idea, if you could I guess if you think about somebody, yeah, I can't find like a better way of explaining it. Like I said, I read it like 50 times. And if you look at that table, did you guys look at that table? There's like a laundry list of these diseases or these health events. But I guess the idea is if you see one person that has that disease, most likely there's going to be others. I think that's kind of the idea, right? So kind of take it for what it's worth. Don't memorize that table or anything like that. Just take it as this is a term that's used and we should know what it's referring to, okay? Put it that way. But I can't like offer a much better sort of detailed explanation of it, okay? So we'll just kind of take it at face value. All right. Where are we now? Oh, okay. In blank, again, you better know this as a biology major. What process converts DNA into mRNA?
Transcription.
Transcription.
And what happens in translation?
Protein.
Yes.
Amino acid.
We make proteins, we make amino acids from the mRNA, right? That mRNA gets translated. Remember, there's these codons that are in the mRNA that code for certain amino acids, and it gets translated into proteins. What about replication? When does replication happen?
Division.
Does,
That's when the cell is
Cell
going to
division.
divide, so it happens before that.
say it again, Rachel?
For cell replication.
Replication, yeah.
During-
What did you say?
I was gonna say it occurs during cell division. So before the cell is gonna divide, it needs to replicate all of its DNA.
Good. Who is that, Manuela?
Yeah.
I see all your pictures there. Okay, yes, that's correct, right? It's only gonna occur before a cell's gonna divide, right? So it's not like replication happens, then transcription and translation. No, they're separate things. So how might replication be related to pathophysiology?
How
Okay.
about the about oncogenic about cancer? Maybe when we say the oncogenes increases cell reproduction and whatever.
Yep, good, right? Marianne, what were you gonna say? Yeah, like what kind of diseases? I mean, Chrysanta just mentioned, right? Cancer, right? If we think about formation of tumors or anything, and we'll do a chapter on like neoplasia where we're talking about, over division of cells. Those cells that are rapidly dividing are going to be replicating their DNA, right? And so, and maybe they're dividing when they're not supposed to. So yes, cancers is the big one. All right, so I'm just trying to make you see that the stuff that we learn in cell bio is applicable to pathophysiology, right, to medicine. All right, we already talked about mutation. Let's move on. It's like I said, it's going to boot me out of here. I should have. No, you'll see. I don't know why. It's stupid. It shouldn't, right? Yeah. An individual has a heterozygous genotype, right, for an autosomal recessive disorder, i.e. my favorite example, cystic fibrosis, okay? The individual is affected by the disorder. True or false here, guys? False. My friends here say false. Why? Correct. The only genotype that would actually have the disorder, if it's autosomal recessive, is homozygous recessive, little c, little c. What do we call this person with that genotype, guys?
Carrier.
Carrier. Yeah. All right, good.
So, Professor,
Yeah, go ahead.
if a person is carrier, are we considering her or him as he having a disease, or we just say carrier is not affected? Maybe carrier is not affected, or
Yeah, you would consider them not affected, but they're a carrier, meaning they're carrying that disease gene, but they don't have the disease. Correct. You would
okay.
Okay. It's false, right? Okay, an individual's home is considered part of their what environment? It's kind of easy, huh?
Physical.
Physical. The actual home, the structure of the home. All right, which of the population listed below are more susceptible to develop disease following an environmental exposure? Oh, yeah. C, right? Both newborn children and geriatric patients are more susceptible to environmental disease, right? So the idea is that if we're talking about things in the environment, right, they obviously affect people differently, right? And we need to consider those sort of populations that are more susceptible in general, okay? And those were some examples there. All right, a point mutation that does not lead to a change in the amino acid sequence of a protein. It's called a what mutation, guys?
Silence.
Silent. So now, again, remember, when we're saying mutation, we're talking about a change in the gene sequence, right? Sometimes there might just be like a single change in a nucleotide that doesn't change the amino acid sequence. So therefore, it doesn't change the function of the protein, right? So it wouldn't lead to any sort of deficit or anything like that. Because I think I used that term before and somebody was asking about that. All right, what about some other types of mutations, guys, that I brought up in chapter 2? So I think Fabi mentioned one before. What's another type?
The nonsense?
Yeah. So yeah, we talked about like missense, nonsense, right? So what are those types of mutations, or what are kind of some potential results of mutations, I guess, in general? One, it might not change the amino acid sequence, right? But say you, a mutation where you deleted like four nucleotides, or even just one nucleotide was deleted. What happens usually with that? Or what
The
could potentially,
protein won't be functional.
why? Oh, here, wait, let me ask this. Why is a deletion of a nucleotide usually more dangerous than just a substitution for a different nucleotide?
Because it might change one nucleotide, and that's going to be either stop amino acid, and then it just cut off the DNA, the sequence.
Yeah, so let me I just want to just do this real quick just so we understand. I don't know if you guys can see the board. I'm going to shut off the projector. Should I? Can you guys see the board? You people on Zoom?
Can sit, but not clear. Yeah, at least then.
Is that better?
Mhm.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Here, can you see me?
Yes.
Thank you, Chrysantha. Okay, so say we have DNA sequence, right, guys? I don't know. Okay, so this is the DNA, right? Let's just do a little review of biology and again, how it's relevant to this real quick, okay? Here's our DNA sequence. So we're gonna go through transcription. I probably should just, whatever. We're gonna go through transcription and we're gonna make some mRNA, okay? So from this, we'll just do this. Okay, so here's our mRNA. All right, now, do you guys agree, like when we're talking about translation and reading this mRNA, it's divided up into these codons, right, guys? Right, that this is gonna code for a certain amino acid. This one, let's make some amino acid. Somebody name an amino acid.
Guanine.
An amino acid.
Oh.
Tyrosine? Whatever. You don't have to memorize any amino acids, but whatever. I just wanted to illustrate the point here. Okay, so here's some amino acids here, right? So what would happen now if, say, we got rid of this T here, just one nucleotide, but we got rid of it. That means this goes away, right? You guys agree? Okay. Now what happens? Everything shifts over. So you completely change what's coded for. Sorry, C, G, another C. Okay, and then no longer are they coding for these amino acids. So potentially a whole bunch of amino acids can be affected, right? Everything basically downstream of that deletion. Does that make sense, everyone?
Yeah.
If you just substituted one here, right, and say this then, instead of it being a T, I think it was a T before, I don't know, whatever, you made it an A, well, it's just gonna be that one codon that would be affected. And in fact, if it's in the third position, most likely it's not gonna have an effect on that amino acid. All right, so I just wanted to just kind of go through that just so you guys can understand why a deletion or adding a nucleotide is much more dangerous than just one sort of substitution, okay? And right, and I talked about missense, nonsense. Did I say did I talk about nonsense or just missense and
Insertion, inversion.
yeah, not silent, right? Nonsense, missense, and silent. So what about nonsense? What happens with nonsense?
It creates a stop codon, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
All right, so instead of this, say, coding for tyrosine here or something like that, it'll code for stop. You could also see why that might be an issue, right? It will truncate the entire rest of the protein, right? And cause it to stop there, okay? And then likely lead to a non-functioning protein. So I'll ask you guys this, again, to kind of put into perspective what we learn in biology to like pathophysiology. So who cares? Who cares if you have one non-functioning protein in your cell? Do you think that really has an effect? One non-functioning enzyme.
Yes.
Yes. You should care.
Well, okay, well, I say yes, because like, in the case if you had like sickle cell anemia, right? You have a change in one amino acid, like you go from, I can't remember specifically which two, but you go from one amino acid to the other one, and now you have sickle cell anemia, and now your blood cells sickle, all because of point mutation.
One protein's ineffective. I mean, it's a pretty important protein, right? Every protein's important. If you're talking about like one non-functioning enzyme, leads to very serious diseases. There's one disease, and now I'm probably not gonna, I don't want to say the wrong name, but anyway, it's a bone disorder. Happen to know like about it because my brother, the company that he works for, Alexion, treats this disease. It's a rare disease, right? But it leads to, if that protein or that enzyme is completely non-functioning, a lot of these infants die right at birth because their thoracic cavity doesn't form correctly, and therefore they're not able to breathe. It's because of one enzyme that's not functioning, right? Okay, if you think about like muscular dystrophy, right? One specific protein in the muscle cell, particularly, part of that sarcomere that's not functioning. Okay, so the answer is yes, you're right. All right, so then you guys should all be happy that your biology majors understand all of this stuff, right? Yeah, yeah.
I just got a notification that we have a new article.
Oh yeah. That must be. Let me fix.
I was like, what?
All right, let me get out of it. I'll get out of this in a second. So if you got some notification from Moodle saying you have something due that you don't know about, it's because the date's wrong. I told you that, but let me fix it right now. All right, that happened with my freshman yesterday. So I got all these emails and they're like, I'm trying to submit this or whatever. And then I was like, what's going on? And then I realized it's because it's an assignment that like I never talked about, and it just automatically put that stupid date in. Anyway. All right, okay, I'll fix it right now. What is it, is it the group project journal article?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, I'll fix that right now. All right, guys, any more questions about that? No. Silence. All right. Let me go back and look. What does it say? It says group project
journal.
article. Oh, does it just say it's available? Let me see. No, maybe not. I probably didn't change that. We'll talk about that after the exam. Yep, it certainly does. It is not. Oh, I know what I did. All right, anyway, we'll talk about that after the exam, okay? So don't worry about that. So for the group project, I think somebody had asked me that question. We'll talk about that after you guys take this exam. What's the problem now? It's mad. Something. So we'll kind of decide who's working with who for the group project, what topic we're going to choose, and then we'll kind of start with that. Okay, so don't worry about that until now. Sorry about that. I don't know. This is new that Moodle just adds due dates for you. Well, because it used to just have like last year's due date. Obviously, then it doesn't matter, right? But now for some reason it automatically puts this year's due date in. Maybe there's a setting I can change, but okay. Questions, guys, from chapters 2 and 3. I mean, maybe. Do we want to go back to one of the chapter 3 case studies before we get off of chapter 3 and move on to chapter 4? Or what do you guys think? Or you want me to go and move on to chapter 4? What do you guys want me to do? Nobody cares?
Well, there's
I think chapter 4.
Yeah?
Chapter 3.
Yeah, chapter 4, because you said it's done.
All right, so let's go to chapter 4. And then, like I said, make sure you guys, if you haven't already, watch that recording for chapter 3, or, well, I should say this. For chapter 3, if you haven't already, it's probably worth it to try to do those review questions on your own, right? Look at the case studies and kind of try to answer some of those case studies, and then look at that recording, or watch that recording or listen to that recording, because I'll go over the review questions, and then I also go over the case studies kind of quickly, but at least show you the answers there. All right, does that sound good? So just a reminder about that. And then if you have questions about chapter 3, then let me know on Monday. Because I will say that I feel like the lecture is kind of takes a more broad approach, right? Because there's so many different specific factors that we could talk about. But then the case studies really address some of those specific environmental factors. So you need to make sure you go through those. Most likely I'll use one of those on the exam. Okay, so that's another good reason to go through them. All right, guys? Make sense? Yeah, so let's move on to chapter 4.
Makes sense.
Okay, so like I said, make sure you take a look at that. So let's look at the case study first, yeah? You know what, one second, let me pull up. Let me stop sharing for 1 second. I'm gonna pull up, I actually pulled out the answers and put them in a Word document so I can actually show them. Since we're recording, you guys can then go back and look at them. As long as I hope we're still recording. We are. All right, 1 second, let me just get that, guys. I should have opened that up already and I forgot. And since my laptop didn't work, I gotta make sure it's here. I don't know why it does that echo. I gotta figure out how to solve that. I did, it was muted. That's why I don't know why it would still do that. It's something with the
has to do with the
camera.
sound interference and stuff like that.
Yeah,
You might
it's
just
just,
have to use your phone or have to put it far away.
yeah. No.
Do you think if you lower the volume of the other device, it won't share?
Oh, maybe if I just lower the volume, whatever, we'll try it. Okay, let me pull this up. Where is it? Here it is. Okay. I'll download that and then I can toggle back, guys. I'll share my screen again and toggle back to this. So there are only 2 case studies in chapter 4, okay? One which sort of illustrates the psychological effects of stress, the other one which sort of illustrates more of the physiological effects, right? Although I guess the Alexander Cho one kind of does both, but anyway. Okay, let me go back. What happened? All right, guys, I'm gonna go back and share my screen again. Sorry about that. And we're still recording, making sure we're still recording. We are. All right, let's pull up that case study. Oh, good job, guys. You all submitted it. Thank you. Oh, usually I look at everyone. Okay, so let's take a look at this. And like I said, I'll kind of go back and forth and just pull up, well, we can talk about the answers themselves. So oh, that doesn't help you guys. So take a second just to re-familiarize yourself with the introduction there. All right, so somebody tell me what they wrote down. And again, remember, there's really no specific correct answer. I guess there definitely can be wrong answers, but there's multiple right answers, right? If Mr. Cho's symptoms were to continue without relief, what possibly could result? Would somebody share what you wrote for this? It's kind of very open-ended, I guess. Who wants to share?
I put that continues with having intentionally.
I'll share.
Oh, wait, 1 second. Marianne's sharing. You probably can't hear her. Go ahead, and then you can share next. Go ahead.
I just feel like we can develop mental and possibly physical disorders. Like you can get depression, or you can develop a physical disorder by potentially not leaving the house or something.
Okay.
Because he's so scared or whatnot like that.
Okay, good. That's kind of what it's getting at, right? All right. So who was that? Kenny that wanted to share? Or no? Whoever that was, share.
Oh, I just said that that he could end up getting sick and he can end up getting a disorder, disease from the buildup of stress and anxiety from the traumatic experience he witnessed.
Good. All right, somebody else. What else? Did anyone else have anything slightly different for that one?
I was wondering, I don't know if this is correct, but I was wondering, like, because I know you were talking about the allostasis, about him changing, his body levels will continue to change.
Yeah, and then he could reach what, allostatic load or whatever, right? Is that kind of what you're
Yeah.
getting? Okay, good. What are some other
Yeah, I
things?
put that, and then I put that he will reach the state of exhaustion, but I don't know if you have to go all the way through the stages first, or your body can go. So I didn't know if that was right, and I also put that that he can disease can occur and it can be fatal.
Yeah, so I think those are all acceptable answers. In terms of like reaching the state of exhaustion, yeah, this question is kind of asking you like down the line what potentially could happen, and so that's true. That could definitely happen. Yeah. All right, so let's see what the book had as their answer. Again, you know that there's always going to be multiple answers here. Where is that? Actually, I guess I don't need that. Okay. Right, so it says could be risk for disease, which you guys said. Also addictive behaviors, right? Like smoking, substance abuse, that's something else that you could have added to this as well, okay? So that's definitely a short answer. I probably would expect you guys to write, you know, two or three sentences. And so on the exam, I would say, you know, like 2 to 3 sentences or something like that, okay? Anything anyone else wants to add to that one? So you can see the next question there. So are we all okay with question 1, guys? All right, so it says, what physiologic symptoms is Mr. Cho manifesting secondary to his stress response? So what are some of the physiological changes that are described here, or symptoms? This is kind of an easy question. Yeah, right? Sweating, chest pain, right? Also mentions anxiety. Okay, so why? And maybe the next question asks this, but what actually is happening physiologically to cause sweating and chest pain or increased heart rate? What's responsible for that?
His sympathetic nervous system is being activated.
Good, the sympathetic nervous system is being activated. When we think about the sympathetic nervous system being activated, primarily what hormone or hormones do we think of?
Norepinephrine, adrenaline.
Yeah, so norepinephrine or epinephrine. Remember, adrenaline and epinephrine are the same thing. It's just 2 different names for the same thing. So yeah, norepinephrine or epinephrine, right? And epinephrine, which are released from where? Where do we get hormonal release of epinephrine and norepinephrine?
Adrenal gland?
Yeah, the adrenal glands, particularly the adrenal medulla. All right, good. So remember that when we talk about symptoms like increased heart rate, right? Heart palpitation, sweating, those kind of things, those are all a result of an increase in sympathetic activity, right? Caused by predominantly epinephrine and norepinephrine release. All right, so let's see what the next, because I think the next question kind of asks you about that. So here's the next one. So again, take a minute to just read through that quickly. All right, so as Mr. Cho's chronic stress sense of physiologic arousal continues, what factors are being activated? I think we just answered that question. But what else? So when we talk about,
too.
Say it again.
Oh, I was just gonna say like an overproduction of cortisol, which then also will cause like an inflammatory response because it shuts down, well, because it releases cytokines, but also shuts down the like immune system in general.
To be careful, if you're talking about inflammation, that's usually kind of like an increase in immune activity. Cortisol really suppresses immune activity, but it does also release cytokines. Remember, in the lecture, I explained to you that it's super complex, the relationship between stress and the immune system. So like, you might not even want to try to understand it right now. So if you see conflicting kind of statements, it's true. It's not like a mistake that there's conflicting statements, right? A lot of the research that's out there kind of shows both things. So yes, it will have immune effects. We'll just kind of leave it at that. But what you said is true, Blossom. What else though? So you mentioned cortisol. So what is that a result of? What pathway is being activated to release cortisol? What do we call it? Not
Is it the
sympathetic.
LCN system?
HPA axis.
HPA axis, right? Stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, right? The end result of it is release of cortisol, again from the adrenal glands, but from the cortex, okay? And cortisol has very different effects than epinephrine and norepinephrine. This isn't the fight or flight, this is different. Usually, if you want to kind of think of it, you can kind of think of it as a sequential kind of thing, right? That it's fight or flight kind of first, the initial quick response, and then HPA is activated. But they're sort of activated at the same time. But it's kind of like, I think conceptually better to kind of think of it that way. The cortisol kind of is released to kind of bring everything back to homeostasis, okay? And again, it has slowing kind of effects, right? It suppresses the immune system. But it still kind of is still part of the stress response. So anyway, it's kind of, again, let's think of, I kind of like to think of it as kind of that sequential thing, but really they're kind of activated at the same time, okay? But they have very different effects, right? And I talk about them in the lecture. All right. Also, there's one other system that I mentioned in the lecture that's activated during stress. Does anyone remember what it is? And that really has different effects than these two that
The
we just.
LCNE system.
So that NE system is really what's happening in the brain and the central nervous system to then ultimately lead to the release of norepinephrine, epinephrine from the adrenals. So that's kind of part of the same fight or flight. But what else? There's one other. I think, yeah, it's listed here. And I don't talk about it a lot.
Endogenous opioid pathway. Oh.
Yeah, so I could talk about it a lot if you guys really wanted me to, but we're not going to. But this is also a pathway that's activated. It's not a pathway that's going to lead to like all these sort of characteristics, effects of stress that we think about, but it kind of comes in. It's really an inhibitory pathway, and so it will interact with both the HPA axis and the sympathetic nervous system kind of activation to sort of suppress. Okay, so the book, mentions it, but really I don't spend a lot of time talking about it. The book doesn't either, so I kind of leave it at that. Again, it's something you could talk about and think about a lot, but when we think about like substance abuse, right? Opiates are a huge, class of drugs that are abused, right? Why? They have these calming effects and they probably do they interact with the stress response, right? So if there's something stressful going on, taking something like that is going to activate this pathway even more, right? And it plays into these other two pathways. So anyway, again, a lot more that you can say about that. So I don't expect you guys to know details about it because we really didn't talk much about it, but that was one of the other pathways that they mentioned, okay?
So you said that it's an inhibitory pathway that interacts with HPA and what else?
And the sympathetic, the fight or flight response, or the sympathetic activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Those two pathways that we're talking about, right? Fight or flight, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and also the HPA axis.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so we only have a few more minutes here, right? So, and again, the term catecholamines is referring to norepinephrine and epinephrine, just so that dopamine is also a catecholamine, but for our purposes now, epinephrine and norepinephrine are catecholamines. Glucocorticoids, what's that referring to?
Cortisol?
Say it again.
The cortisol?
Yep, the cortisol, okay? Just so that you guys know when you see those terms. All right, so this then kind of, number 4, right, asks about, it says, what substance will indicate immunopathology? So if you look at, it's saying here, again, both things, right? Both norepinephrine and epinephrine and release of cortisol ultimately can lead to effects on the immune system, okay? So again, we kind of leave it like that. I don't expect you guys, you know, to throw out things like lymphocyte trafficking or anything like that. For sure, I know my nursing majors aren't gonna even know, you know, be able to throw something out like that, okay? So remember that I'm not expecting you guys to know specifics about how exactly these pathways interact with the immune system. I think that that just kind of gets, we start to go too far away from what we're focusing on, okay? So that can kind of, I probably wouldn't maybe ask a question like that, I guess, on the exam, or your answer can kind of be, it can suppress immune activity, but in some instances it might activate it, right? So understand that it's complex and be able to convey that. But in terms of details, exactly what's happening, I'm not gonna ask you that. Does that help, guys? Just so you kind of know where I'm coming from with that. All right. So there's a last couple questions here. Okay, so take a minute just to read that. Okay, some more there. I think we kind of talked, I mean, we kind of talked about some of this already. I feel like some of it's a little bit of a little redundant, right? But we're specifically focusing on the stage of alarm here, okay? So if we go here, stage of alarm, again, surge of catecholamines, that's the sympathetic nervous system activation, norepinephrine and epinephrine, okay? Number 6, what is it asking for 6? Describe the factors that may have a mediating effect on Mr. Cho's response to stress.
So I had a question about that specifically. Like, when I answered it, I kind of thought of what could be some coping mechanisms for him.
Yep.
Is that along the right lines or no?
Yeah, exactly. That's what it's getting at. And again, if I ask these questions or these types of questions on the exam, I'll make sure it's sort of clear in terms of what I'm asking you. And so, yeah, if you look at the answer that the book kind of presents here, right, it is focusing on coping, right? Says, Mr. Cho may still view the initial event, right, as threatening, but effective adaptation may occur when he feels supported and confident that he can manage the situation, right? So what do we mean, I guess, how would you define coping kind of in general? Or why do we talk about coping when we're talking about stress? What else did you guys put for that question, I guess? Maybe that might get at that.
I put basically like therapy because
the negative feedback.
Who's that? Who said that, Mariana?
I didn't say anything.
Oh, Blossom first. I know you started talking, and then whoever else started talking. Blossom, what did you say?
Oh, I just said like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is just generally where if they feel like they're heard and they're given like ways to actually cope in a positive way, then they can feel like they're supported in that way.
Yep. Yeah, good. I mean, anything along those lines. Again, it could be, and for every individual it might be different, right? But again, coping is the idea of tapping into whatever resources you have available, right? Either internally, right, or externally, okay? So Blossom mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy. It could be something as simple as talking to a friend, right, or a family member. It could be meditation. It could be exercise, right? It's whatever coping mechanisms are gonna be suited, you know, sort of best suited for the individual. Okay, so yeah, that's what that question's getting at. It's getting at the coping sort of concept, okay? And so then it says also too, but effective adaptation may occur. So I think in the beginning of the lecture, kind of talk about the stressful stimuli, right? but then you have to consider coping and then how your body or the patient's body will adapt, to that situation, right? Or do they adapt? If they don't adapt, then what's going to happen?
They essentially go through like all these processes because
Yeah, right. They're going to continue, right? It's just going to keep happening, right? And then, you get to a point where you can't handle it anymore, right? Whether it's because of you revisiting the same event, or maybe there's other stressors that come into play, right? So it's super important that we know how to cope, right? We know what resources are available so that it doesn't lead to this sort of state of exhaustion and you can't handle it anymore, or you have a heart attack because of the physiological effects, right? Those are real. All right, anything else you guys want to add to that there?
We're still on number 6, right?
Say it again?
We're still on number 6, right?
Yes, correct. We're still on number
Okay.
6.
I have put the negative feedback loop. Well, negative feedback response.
Elaborate a little bit more, because I think it's because of the way they sort of vaguely ask the question, right? Yeah. What factors? Okay, go ahead. Go with that.
Yeah, the factor that I put was the release of cortisol, because I know they said that generates the negative feedback response.
Yeah.
Well, I think I read that somewhere in the PowerPoint.
Correct. So once cortisol is released and enough of it's released, that cortisol actually feeds back to receptors in the brain and turns off that sort of HPA axis, that pathway. It's actually not by directly in the hypothalamus, but there's other brain areas that feed into it. But you're right, because then that will turn it off. So if you think about physiologically answering that question, that works, right? I would definitely accept that answer. All right, good.
Dr. C?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, you can hear me now? Okay, good. So for 6, I kind of focused on what he did. So as part of my answer, I put that as his coping mechanism, he deliberately tried to avoid the train or any train track or anything that reminded him of the event. Would that also be acceptable?
So do you think that that's a good coping mechanism?
Well, I don't think it's a good one. I was just focusing it on the fact that that's what he did.
Yeah, I see why you did that, because it kind of looks like it's asking you specifically to what information it gave you already. But I think it was trying to get at that kind of what kind of could he have done. So I think it could have been asked in a different way. But yeah, I get why you sort of did it that way. But just kind of on that, right? That isn't a good way of coping, right? I mean, maybe it is like in a therapeutic way. Like if you're talking about cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of times you're sort of trying to extinguish this sort of association that you have, right? Of these kind of, the association between whatever's reminding you of that event and that event, right? So in some ways you might want to do that, but by revisiting that or avoiding situations that remind you of it, what then will that lead you, probably push you towards? What neuropathology? What disorder does that sound like?
PTSD.
Yeah, anxiety or PTSD, right? It's one of the hallmark symptoms of anxiety, or one of the main symptoms, is avoidance, right? Because you're avoiding anything that might remind you, and then it starts interfering with daily life, right? You don't want to go out, you can't do anything. Then that sort of leads you down that sort of wrong path. But Rachel, to answer your question, I see why you kind of answered it that way. It's just because it's vaguely asked. So I'm all right with that answer. All right. The last 2 questions there. So just read that. We'll answer the last 2 questions, and then we are done. All right. So it's kind of listing all of these things that you might suggest to the patient, right, to help better cope with this situation, right? Number 7 says, how can meditation or guided imagery help to mediate stress responses? What do you think it's actually kind of kind of interacting with, and what is it sort of suppressing, I guess? Yep. There's lots of evidence where, right, that meditation, guided imagery can decrease heart rate, right, decrease blood pressure. There also have been studies where they've done EEG measurements of brain activity, and that meditation suppresses brain activity, right? So it's the idea of kind of counteracting that sympathetic activation, right? What else? Did anyone have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, I also focused on the fact that it can help to, I don't know, change his perspective, because in one of the, I guess, one of the annotations or one of the kind of graph thingies with the arrows, I saw that you had health, and then you had, I think, positive, I forgot the word, interpretation, positive interpretation. So I kind of focused it on that to say that along with relaxing him, it could also help to change his mindset and the way how he thinks about the situation, and then that can kind of help him long term in, like, you know, not having anxiety when it comes down to trains and stuff.
Correct, because at the end of the day, right, it's all about interpretation. And yeah, there was kind of we talked about different models, right? There was one model that really thinks about kind of, or is focused on the patient's perception, right? And so by revisiting it by guided imagery, it helps to change your perception of that event. And then each time you think about it sort of down the line, this takes time. Again, maybe it doesn't trigger that sympathetic response anymore, right? Because you sort of changed your response to it. So yeah, that's good, Rachel. All right, last one. What do they ask there? What role does cardiovascular fitness play in helping a patient with a stress disorder? I mean, you guys can answer this probably in a bunch of different ways too. I mean, what did somebody put for this? Without even, let's get rid of this, what it says there, because you can answer this in many ways. What'd you put? What some of you put here?
Increases the heart rate.
Okay, but would you necessarily want to increase the heart rate if we're kind of thinking of like increased sympathetic activity?
And no.
Maybe not, right? Like, I mean, you could see how like increasing the heart rate in that situation might be helpful, because you could rationalize that, put it that way. But if you kind of just take it at face value, you might want to think about it that way. But something else. Sierra, what'd you put? Okay. 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 And so you want to try to get at kind of why and what might make you feel better, right? Maybe it's just because you see your friends at the gym, right? Again, it's that physical response. What does anyone ever hear of runner's high? What's the cause, or what's the endogenous factor that's believed to be responsible for runner's high?
Endorphins?
Endorphins.
And what system are endorphins part of? One that we mentioned when we first started this case study was that third one, opioid system. Endogenous opioid system. Endorphins, they bind to the mu receptor. Endorphins bind to the same receptor that morphine and heroin bind to. Okay? So you could even think of it that way too, that it's going to activate that endogenous opioid system that will help kind of suppress. But anyway, you could have, again, answered that in a few different ways. All right, guys, so that's it, right? We're done at 12:35. You know, I'll stay for a little while if anyone has any other questions. Again, if you haven't listened to chapter 4, do, it's long. But you got to spend a decent amount of time with this. So I expect that you do know details for exactly what's happening when the HPA axis becomes activated, right? In terms of like, what does the hypothalamus release? What does the pituitary release, right? And all of that kind of So there's kind of three main, I think there's kind of three big figures there. There's it shows you one side by side, where it has HPA axis and then sympathetic. But then there's also a figure where it shows you some brain areas that are kind of involved in responding to that stress, or kind of where the incoming stimuli are going to come in, and then there's processing that goes on that will then activate those pathways. So there's a couple important figures in there. And we can review those more on Monday, okay? So there's probably more review that we need to do for chapter 4 even, right? So make sure you, on your own, review for chapter 3. Look at those case studies. And on Monday, you need to come with questions. I want you to be like, hey, Dr. C, go over this, and we can kind of, I want to make sure I answer all of your questions or clarify whatever needs to be clarified on Monday, okay? All right, so if you guys got somewhere to go, by all means, log off. If you have more questions, I'm here.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. C.
You're welcome. Bye, Gabby.
Dr. C, I don't know if you saw, but I couldn't hear you at the beginning, so I had to log off and then come back in. I put it in the chat, but I don't know if you've gotten a chance to look at it yet.
Yeah, okay. No
I just wanted
worries.
to make sure you knew I
Yeah,
was
I
here.
saw it, Carolee.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Dr. C, I have a question. So